This week in the Regency, it's the post-chaise. It's not spelt that way. It's spelt post-chaise in the French, and it comes from the French, obviously, from the French for chair. But in English, it's pronounced post-chaise with a ch. And it comes out of the idea of a chair on wheels, effectively. It's one of the smaller carriages, and it's not meant to contain more than 2 or possibly 3 thin people. So our jumping off point today is the 14th of May, 1817, and it's to be sold by private contract by Messrs. Tattersall at Hyde Park Corner. I wish I could get an image of this. Nearly 100 very excellent and fashionable carriages of various descriptions by the best makers, among which are several good coaches, a variety of very elegant chariots and post-chaises nearly as good as new. So what's a post-chaise? So let's have a look at it from William Felton's treatise on carriages. We have this fantastic drawing. This is a perch post-chaise. And what does that mean? It means that it's got 2 pieces coming up. These are the perch. This is the perch. And then underneath the carriage itself, the body of the carriage, is leather. So it's leather straps. Those the thing that looks like a pulley almost is leather straps that hold it. And so it didn't bump, but it did jostle quite a lot, just moved quite a lot on those leather straps, and particularly swaying from side to side, and apparently wasn't great for people who had motion sickness. So how much does a post-chaise like this cost? The first charge, the absolute basic charge, is £93. So it's quite a lot of money. And it's interesting how Felton positions it. He says families who often journey from place to place with post horses do well to furnish themselves with a post-chaise, though it saves nothing of the expenses in travelling, whether with their own or postmaster's carriage. Yet a convenience more than adequate to the expense of the carriage is in the end to be met with, as the necessity of removing from one carriage to another and shifting the luggage is thereby avoided, an inconvenience too great to be submitted to by any gentleman who can afford the additional expense of keeping their own post-chaise. A plain light carriage is to be preferred, if only to be used for posting work. But if the journeys are occasional, a chariot with such a coach box as can be removed will answer the purpose best. So this is what a chariot with a post box which can be removed looks like. You can see it's a lot fancier. And one of the things that is relevant to the difference between this, a town chariot, and the post-chaise is that the post-chaise is designed for swift travel. And so it has all the extras taken off because any extras will slow down the horses. And so we have, as it's kind of basic, at its basic level, what was called a yellow bounder, because they were all pretty much yellow, it's stripped back of everything. Because what you're trying to do is to make it as light as possible, so that the horses can pull it either faster or further. How many horses? Usually 2 to start with if you weren't really rich. And I want to point out that one of the great advantages of a post-chaise is that it doesn't have a driver. It has a postilion or postboy. And so this is the guy riding the horse, riding the near horse. They always rode the left-hand one. And you can see that there are windows in the front. And the great advantage of this as a traveling coach is that you just get a much better view of the countryside. And when we look, we see that this is a close-up of that image. We see it's not very big. It only holds 2 people. I guess you could put a kid in there as well, maybe, but effectively it's quite small. And that means that you couldn't take your maid with you if you went on an elopement. And if you were with a young, if you were 2 young people together in this, you were in quite close proximity. But that window at the front is one of the reasons it was great for traveling. But the other reason is that it was quite fast because they're small, only 2 people, not much luggage. There's very little room for luggage. If we look back at our initial image, those 2 brown boxes there are all you've got for your luggage. The main issue here is to just get over difficult ground as lightly as possible. So it's possible to have 4 if you want to go faster. And this is from an advertisement. And you see that we have 4 horses here and 2 postilions. And the guy in the front is in charge. The whips are used mostly for guidance rather than like whipping up the horses. I mean, it happened, but they were too expensive to treat badly. And each of those postilions has 2 sets of reins in his hand. And of course, in this case, these people are obviously quite well off because they have a couple of guards coming back with them or attendants or whatever. So quite often, if the nobility was traveling, they would be in a chaise and their servants and baggage would come behind or go before, quite often in a coach, because this was by far the most pleasant way of traveling. If you went for one of those chariots, so this is a town chariot which can have the driver's box removed to turn it into a post-chaise, and that was the first charge for the plain post-chaise, and the actual chariot went up to like 113. So what did they do? What did they look like? Well, they were all yellow, as I said, pretty much. This is one where they've got the servant sitting outside. So that was another option, but you couldn't do that with 2 horses. You had to have 4 to be able to put a kind of dicky seat at the back. And the ones out the back there would be the valet and maid, 100%. And some of them had a luggage rack on top and a place for footmen to stand behind, as in this one. But those poor horses, there's 4 horses there. You can just see the hindquarters of the leading pair. Obviously, it was a lot harder on the horses, on the near horses, the ones the postilions rode, because they're carrying the weight of the person as well as pulling the carriage. And that, of course, it means that postilions were always chosen to be small men. They're very similar to a kind of build of a jockey nowadays. I'm going in a later video to go into details about posting inns, but basically the idea of a post-chaise was that you went as far as you could in what was called a stage, a single stage. Usually, certainly 20 miles would be a long stage. Usually they were shorter than that. And then you pulled into a coaching inn like this one, in much the same way that you would pull into a service station to refuel. The ostlers would come out and change the horses. So say you were going from, I don't know, Northumberland down to London, and you had your own post-chaise because you agree with William Felton that it was worthwhile not to have to get out every time you get to one of these places and change the luggage over and change everything over and get into a new carriage, right? You would take your own horses on the first stage. You would have your own postilion on the first stage. And at the inn, the postilion would stay with your horses and take them home again. Or if you knew you were coming back reasonably soon, he would stay in the stables with the horses. They usually had places for grooms and postilions to sleep above the stables. And he would stay there until you came back, and then you would take your own horses home again. It's quite complicated. It's a really interesting system. And England in particular had set itself up in this system more comprehensively, I think, than European countries had, mainly because they had better roads by this stage, and the toll roads were paying for those better roads. The tolls were paying for it. But effectively, the post-chaise is there as a way of getting around the country privately, as opposed to these coaches, which, as you see, were anything but private, whether that was the mail coach or the stage coach. And so you could either have your own carriage or you could hire one. And if you hired one, typically you hired the chaise and the horses as one, and then you had to hire a new one and then a new one. If you knew you were coming back, you could hire the carriage for the entire journey, and then you just changed horses and postilions. But the horses and the postilions stayed together. And so they were quite important, obviously quite important, just as important as a driver, and even more need to be responsible, because they stayed with the horses and brought the horses either back with another carriage or back on their own to whoever had rented them out. So how much did all that cost? Well, it cost quite a lot comparatively, but it did go quite fast. So an average speed of between 6 and 10 miles an hour. It increased as the roads got better. So late 18th century, say about 1790s, we have some evidence that it was about 6 miles an hour, and it increased a little bit over the next 20 years or so. The average cost was, though, quite expensive, an average cost of over £1 per mile. And that could be anything from 1 shilling, 1 pence, 1 penny, up to possibly even £1 and 6pence. I think on average it's probably about 1 shilling 2pence per mile. So a long journey, like a journey to Gretna Green, for example, would cost a lot of money, like a lot of money. So one stage of 12 miles, which was quite common, would be £1. That was significantly more than you would pay on the stage or on the mail coach. So if you had a journey of 60 miles, which isn't that far, it was £5. And that's a lot of money for an average person. So average people didn't do this. They didn't post, as it was called. They went on the stage or they went on the mail coach. Or if they were not well off and it wasn't too far to go, they went on a carrier's cart. People, the wagons that delivered goods, or they went on a barge, which was even slower. So postilions were very important, and they were always called post boys, but they, generally speaking, were not boys. And obviously, if you were leaving a real expensive group of horses, you wouldn't necessarily want a 12-year-old looking after it. And here's an advertisement from Ireland in the month of May. Wanted a smart boy who can drive as a postilion and who can take good care of horses. He must attend at table when required. Apply at 24 Stephen's Green, which is in Dublin. And so people who were, well enough off to have their own carriage, the person wouldn't necessarily be employed full-time as a postilion because they wouldn't be traveling full-time, and he would be expected to be a groom. and possibly other duties as well in a smaller household. They weren't all boys. They were often older men, and they were natty. They had beaver hats and a kind of livery, depending on which inn they worked for. But they were very often older men who were very experienced with horses and who could be relied upon not to steal them or to run off with them on a joyride or whatever. Post-chaises were a sign of money. And one of the things that this system allowed inns to do was to keep the money to themselves, like to keep the rich people. By having horses there ready for hire for the next stage, they ensured that patrons came to their inn, and the patrons that did come to their inn that needed post horses, they were plump in the pocket. And were going to be good customers, generally speaking. They were gentry. That's this week in the Regency. I'm Elizabeth Layton. I'll see you next week in the Regency.